Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here is your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. Coming at you today nearly live. We're in Manchester, New Hampshire. First time we've been out of the country. We're down here on a baseball road trip. And it's actually a trip that 200 years ago wouldn't have been able to happen. Not only because there was no professional baseball to go watch, but because there was a war going on between the United States and the British colonies, which later would become Canada. We figured, why not get an American perspective, because we've been fed a Canadian perspective for so long. So we're down here talking to John Resch from the University of Manchester, or University of New Hampshire at Manchester. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for doing this.
Well, thank you. Really enjoyed being here, Sean.
Oh, good. We're happy to have you. And I will say up front that this is a friendly environment.
Yes.
We're not going to rehash any old tensions. Now, the War of 1812 on its own as a conflict is very interesting, but it traces back, and it can be traced back to the American Revolution, because the United States, or at least the 13 colonies at that time, did invade into Quebec in 1775.
Yes.
So coming out of the Revolution, or even during the Revolution, how were the northern colonies of Britain perceived by the United States?
They're perceived as really being part, or potentially part, of the American independence and revolutionary movement. And in 1775, you mentioned the invasion of Canada. The intention of the American government in 1775, still not declaring independence, was to foment revolution, rebellion in Canada, recruit troops from Canada in order to support the armed resistance against Great Britain. And so the plan was that Montreal would be taken, and it was, and that there would be a twin attack upon Quebec, coming up from Montreal with Montgomery, and then Arnold coming up through Canada. And the Canadians were able to stop that attack.
Yes.
And the plaques are still there. We've been to Quebec City, and there is the plaque where Montgomery was killed, and also the plaque in the lower city where the attack by Arnold was also stopped by the Canadians.
Yeah.
But that resulted in a kind of siege of Canada, but the Americans soon desist from that siege. They had to retreat, and it turned out to be a real defeat for the Americans in 1776.
Right. Now, but that, despite that didn't, we were talking before, that did not completely take away the desire or the thought that Canada was still going to join.
Yes. There's always this interest during the Revolution that Canada would become part of this new territory, this new country that eventually would emerge. And in 1777, when the Americans created their first constitution called the Articles of Confederation, which governed the nation between 1777 and 1786, when the Constitution was finally developed and then approved later. There is a specific article in the Articles of Confederation directed at Canada saying that when Canada is interested in becoming part of the United States, they're automatically admitted as another state.
Well, that's a nice invitation. You know, you don't have to do any paperwork.
No
just
paperwork.
You're
You're part of the gang. All you have to do is just sign up, and you're with us as a state. And during the Revolution, Canadians were enlisted, recruited for the Continental Army. There was a particular regiment led by a person by the name of Hazen, who was an American but lived in Canada and recruited Canadians to fight for the Americans. So there's this legacy that continues in the late 18th century and into the 19th century that Canada will be or should be part of the United States.
But I'm curious in that, the mythology in Canada is that, we're basically settled by loyalists at this point, especially in Nova Scotia and then in what's now Ontario, in southern Ontario. Did that change the perception of the United States at all? Would people maybe think, well, do we really want these people? These were the people who didn't support us before, so why don't we just leave them alone and they can do their own thing?
Yeah, very good point, and particularly the French-Canadian settlements in Catholic, which was kind of an anathema to Protestant New Englanders. The exodus of loyalists to Nova Scotia and to Canada would give weight as British loyalists after the American Revolution and after America became independent. But one curious thing happened in this period between 1787 and 1812 is a lot of Americans migrated to Canada, and particularly around York, or now Toronto.
Yeah.
And it was thought on the eve of the War of 1812 that there were so many Americans that had migrated and moved up to Canada, something like 50,000, that the interest of these people would be to reconnect politically, nationally, with America. So in the beginning of the War of 1812, it was thought by planners that an invasion of Canada would be welcomed.
Right.
And greeted by people who would be willing to support the invaders, the Americans.
I believe one of the off-cited things in Canada is that, I think it was Thomas Jefferson said it would only be a matter of marching. That's a favorite one in Canada, that didn't quite happen. Yeah. And I think it's especially because there's so much family, there's ties back and forth. Yes. I think that was a large part of it as well. That, sure, individual families were going, but you still have these sort of kinship networks that are across the border. People who are still familiar with each other. So at what point then, because was there agitation then for a real invasion through the late 18th century, or did it wait until the early 19th century? Sort of at what point was there legitimate talk amongst people in the American government towards another invasion?
It's really in the beginning of the 19th century with the provocation of the British government and the interference of American trade, stopping neutral trade, if you will, to the continent and to Britain, the impressment of sailors, the British stain on American honor and power. And so there was an effort to resist these British policies. But one of the curious things about the resistance of the British policies is that the way of doing it was going to be to invade Canada. So there might be two objectives here. One, this is a way to fight Great Britain. The other is to fulfill the ambition from the Revolutionary War to make Canada part of the United States. With this, as Thomas Jefferson, you're quoted saying, all we have to do is to send some troops up there, and the Canadians will join us, and we'll have it. And so the first military actions are against Canada. In the Niagara region and in the Detroit area.
Because there's also the logistical issue that you just can't sail across the Atlantic Ocean and actually attack Britain. I guess was there ever any talk then maybe of just supporting the French and Napoleon, because Britain's tied up with that at the time? That maybe you can do that, send support that way?
Oh, good. That's a really interesting point, because the issue of Napoleon and England is not only an international issue because they were at war with each other since the French Revolution, but it's also a fault line of American politics. There are large groups of people, largely associated with the Republican Party, Thomas Jefferson in particular, and Madison, who are sympathetic to the French, in part because of their support of the Americans during the Revolution, but also because of their hatred of England. So it's kind of a dual motivation of affection and hatred. On the other hand, there's a group of people, the Federalists, largely located in the New England area, are very sympathetic to England and hostile to France. So the War of 1812 has a repercussion domestically on American politics in further dividing these two groups that had already been divided by the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and now we've got the War of 1812, which adds to the political conflict, the political differences which had existed for a couple of decades.
Whenever because these things are never completely unified, right? There's always some sort of partisan divide somewhere that has to be overcome in order to make a decision and get everyone behind it.
Well, one of the curious things about this partisan divide is that the area most affected by the Orders in Council, the French policies, and the continental policies of Napoleon was New England. But it was New England that voted against the war. The part of the country that was least affected by British maritime policies and the Napoleonic maritime policies was the Midwest, we'll call it, Ohio, Kentucky, that area. The South, that's the area that supported the war, along with Pennsylvania that supported the war.
Was that interesting? That sounds interesting to me.
It is interesting.
Is it still a Quaker-dominated area?
No, not at this time. It's still not. It's not Quaker-dominated. And historians look at this and say, well, intuitive response would be the area most affected by those policies would be for the war, and the areas least affected would be opposed to the war, and it's just the opposite. And why? Well, one explanation is partisanship. The New England is federalist, sympathetic toward England, does not want a war with England. They have been tarnished with the accusation by the Republicans that they're monarchists.
No.
That they want to restore the monarchy in the United States. It's like, if you can imagine, in the 1950s, a person in the United States being tarred with a label of communist sympathizer. In the 1810, 1812, you would be labeled with monarchical sympathizer. And that would raise tremendous passions among people. So that partisan divide occurs in the decision to go to war, which was one of the closest votes in going for war in the United States. The other ambition is that this will be a war, an opportunity, this war will provide an opportunity for the United States to expand its territory. And there were the so-called war hawks from Kentucky and Tennessee and the Ohio area, who wanted the invasion of Canada to succeed in order to remove British influence and British influence over Indians, which they thought was retarding their ability to get more land. There's also the ambition of going into Florida and getting that territory, and even into Cuba in order to get more territory.
Wow.
So there are all kinds of agendas that the war provides an opportunity for people to follow. The curious thing about the war, of course, as you know, is the Americans, as Jefferson said, we're going to march in, it's going to be successful. Well, they marched, and it was highly unsuccessful. Defeated. In fact, the Canadians took control of Michigan, and then eventually had to retire because of the defeat of the British fleet in Lake Erie by Admiral Perry. So they lost their ability to support that extension of Canada. So wouldn't it have been curious if the War of 1812 had resulted in Canadian territorial expansion, and you would ended up with Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota.
Although those states are pretty much Canadian anyway. My cousin started dating a guy from Minnesota, and we just dated Canadian. It's the same thing.
Same thing.
They're the same people. I mean, come on.
You're right.
Now, so there's a split in this divide politically. Is there a sense of what sort of ordinary people think? I hate the term ordinary people, but you're citizens sort of every day, whether carpenters or whatever, just sort of your people going on about their day-to-day lives. Are they concerned with this? Are they following the politicians' lead? What's the sort of feel around the country? Yeah,
that's another excellent question, because it reveals essentially deep divisions within American society apart from partisan divisions. If you wanted to measure the response of the ordinary people, one measure for that would be, well, how enthusiastic were they in volunteering for the militias, the state militias, or for the federal troops that were being raised to fight this war? And the answer is, those ranks were bare. People didn't volunteer.
Oh, wow.
And the government would set these enlistment quotas, 25,000, 30,000 men. They're not getting them because people aren't signing up. There's not much enthusiasm for this war. And when the militia turns out, it's not enthusiastic either, even if it has to be turned out by the governors of the states. The other part that is reflective of the lack of enthusiasm or public support for this war is, presumably, the president has the capacity to, quote, nationalize the state militias, the state armies, in defense of the nation. Madison called out the militias of New York and Vermont to assist in the attacks upon Canada, and particularly the one in Vermont. The governor said, no, they're not going to cross the state line.
Wow.
And so there was this conflict between the national government and the governor, in this case, over the control of the militia and his refusal to allow the militia to support the government's policy.
Wow.
Well, Vermont had the reputation of essentially taking advantage of the war by becoming a place where smuggling occurred between Canada and the United States. Trade continued. And so this whole idea of the war, from the Federalist position, from trade opposition to Madison as a Republican president, resulted in really a mediocre, lack of enthusiastic, low enlistment rates for the military, the land forces. So the only area, which we probably are aware of, where the Americans could, in the press, beat their breasts, say we've been successful, was on sea, on the sea. So the success of some individual sea battles was, when you look at the newspapers, big headlines about these great successes and the valor and the honor of American society. Just to close on a point that I found in my research when I was looking at, another subject, but it was connected to this, is we're looking at an era in the United States when the revolutionary generation is dying off, and a new generation is coming into being, and also America is changing, becoming there's some of these democratic rumblings that are occurring, but there's still the old 18th century hierarchical perspectives that occur, as well as revolutionary thinking, but new commercial ideas that are beginning to undermine some of those ideals of the Republican. Leaders were concerned that the United States was a country, but not a nation. That the people, the new generation, had not coalesced into a common body, a body politic that shared common values. And one of the hopes of the war was that the war would unite the people, that it would reinvigorate their revolutionary fervor, that it would stimulate a renewal of the ideals of the revolution. It didn't happen, but that was one of the hopes that would occur.
It's like a foreshadowing of Lyndon Johnson warning about the military-industrial complex. It's a sort of
it's also this idea that wars unite rather than divide. But the American experience is, that's true in World War II, but not so much in Korea, and certainly not Vietnam.
No.
And in the case of the War of 1812, the political hope, if you will, or imagination was the war would bring people together. However, after the war, there's a real burst of American nationalism as people saw that the war had not succeeded in bringing people together, in fact, divided people. So that's when you find the effort to preserve the revolution, to set up monuments, to save the documents, to honor the veterans. This would be the way to try to rekindle and establish the revolutionary ideals and values in the new generation.
Would that maybe account for things like the Star-Spangled Banner getting as much publicity as it did, and then later, I think I saw, it wasn't until, 1930?
1936 it
becomes that's the actual official anthem, but people were using it prior to. But so things like that, and maybe Andrew Jackson rising in public life as much as he did. So that's a product of that, people trying to preserve these ideals afterwards, as opposed to really caring about it during.
And also putting a spin on the war. And you mentioned Jackson. Jackson, of course, his success at New Orleans and just a handful of Americans killed in contrast to thousands of British killed and wounded. A battle occurring after the peace agreement had occurred.
They needed email.
They needed email, they wouldn't have had that. But that battle was portrayed in a way as a result of this battle, the Americans got the peace treaty. And so we won the war. We got what we wanted. But the peace treaty didn't create anything new. It just went back to the way things were. But here's another example of putting a spin on a battle that gives people the impression that the objectives of the war had been achieved, despite the fact they had not.
You mentioned James Madison as the president. Now, I've read a little bit about him, not much. Sort of what was his general foreign policy view on things? Sort of where did he stand in these debates?
Yeah, good question again. Madison, of course, is one of the icons of American history. Although he never fought in the American Revolution, he is seen as, quote, the father of the American Constitution and the role that he played at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He's one of the principal authors of the Federalist Papers, which is a foundational political theory or thinking for the American society and understanding the Constitution. But Madison is, as a president, was not a very effective president. He was carrying on Jefferson's policies of trying to force England and France to abandon their restrictions through an embargo. And that didn't work. So as a person engaged in foreign policy, he's not viewed as an individual who's either adept, skilled, effective. One of the things that is kind of curious about Madison is that he was thinking that what Americans needed to do in this war was, quote, defend their honor. That national sovereignty was at stake here, not ships at sea, but America's independence. So he wanted to portray this war as the second war of American independence, as a way of affirming to the world our sovereignty, as well as making Americans feel proud of their honor. We've used war to uphold our honor.
Yes.
But as we've talked about earlier, Americans didn't respond to those appeals to nationalism, as he was attempting to do it, honor, as well as this idea of national identity.
Yeah. Now, I think I read somewhere, and I would have done this a long time ago. It was in. I remember it was in Barbados.
Yeah.
I spent my third year of my undergrad in Barbados, and I was doing something on the War of 1812 because I took an American history class in Barbados, and it was really interesting because, and it was 2005, and a lot of the people down there were very not thrilled with the United States, mostly because of Iraq. That was sort of the sentiment. So I was taking this class, and it wasn't very positive, really, about anything in American history, with the exception of the War of 1812. And it might have been because the professor, I was the Canadian kid, so he was like, "Yeah, the United States won, yeah," and he was ramping it up like that. So I decided to write a paper. So I decided to write a paper on it, and I think I saw somewhere that James Madison had written a letter saying, "If we take Canada, we would be willing to give it back in negotiations for other things." Does that strike you as being at all possible?
I would be surprised that would be something that's offered, because Canada was seen as the prize and the natural extension of the United States, as mentioned from the Revolutionary period into the War of 1812. So it's possible, but I kind of would be skeptical about that.
Well, was going north sort of on equal terms with going west in terms of territorial expansion, or was one... Because the way I've always read it is that the desire to just keep going west and let's go west, go west, go west, and sort of north if we can. Like, we're not as thrilled about going north, but we'll go north if we can. But are they equal? Are they on equal terms, or
the West has a mystique about it, and going west was the natural momentum for Americans, whether it was from the East Coast through the Alleghenies and then across the Mississippi. But continental unity, particularly Canada, joined with the United States, seemed like the natural extension of the United States. So going north, while not necessarily a real force in terms of, I would just call it natural immigration, that is, Americans moving west within their own territory. But nevertheless, the sort of the mythology of having Canada eventually join with the United States was still there. The war provides the opportunity to acquire it. And if it had been acquired, I would imagine that the immigration that we talked about before, particularly in that Niagara region and Toronto, that would probably have increased. Because now that territory is open under federal law for people to settle. And the federal government would be using its incentives to develop those areas, and to provide opportunities for people to settle.
Well, I mean, I think one way you could defend against that is take a bunch of Americans from like Tennessee, put them up in North Bay, Ontario in February, and see if you still want it, guys. You know?
Yeah, I imagine they would be around the Great Lakes. Is what I'm imagining. Ontario and Erie on the north sides of that.
It's pretty much where we all settled anyway.
Yeah.
You know? So in this preamble to the war, where people are starting to get amped up about it, and you're starting to mobilize a little bit. At what point was it really a foregone conclusion? Like, at what point really was the decision made that war was the only option to get what these people wanted?
They're heading towards war in 1811. Mm-hmm. And it's a process which has historical precedent, which is eliminating other possibilities. And then what was kind of submerged this issue of honor and sovereignty, which was a major motivation for Republicans who were thinking abstractly about, quote, the nation and the nation's unity and that sort of thing. That began to become even greater in importance. So the particulars like impressment and curtailment of trade would be the irritants that people could turn to and say, this is what happens to you when you no longer have your sovereignty.
Right.
Other countries dictate to you.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't resist this dictation, you lose your honor and your standing in the world. And there is this view that America has a special role to play. Mm-hmm. The idea of, quote, exceptionalism is there. And the need then to preserve the revolution is translated into defending honor and sovereignty. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't take, but nevertheless, that's what leaders are thinking.
Yeah,
Just like, in Iraq, when they were saying, we're going to democratize Iraq. Yeah. So you have these abstractions that we're going to recreate the Middle East. We'll settle the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, but we have to go through Baghdad to do it. I mean, these abstractions that drive people. Yeah. But what Americans feared, or made to fear anyway, about Iraq, of course, was weapons of mass destruction and resistance of the Saddam Hussein for inspection. So that, was the immediate cause, but the abstraction is the thing. Yeah. So what happens to the great plan? It gets subverted by the realities on the ground in Iraq. So there's, I'm just mentioning that because there may be some parallels people could think about between the abstractions of honor and sovereignty and the abstractions of democratization.
But it's interesting because while that, as you say, that might not have happened during the war, sort of post-war, these things come through and sort of buoy the country a little bit because, what I find is an interesting war because Canadian textbooks will say Canada won, American textbooks will say America won, British textbooks will say like we're cool too, we're fine with how everything played out, and so it's a war where there's this constant debate over like who won. And I was at the Canadian War Museum last week. They have a special temporary exhibit, which I'm assuming will be up, until 2015, until the end of the war. This is my or the end of the anniversaries of the war is my guess. And it's in their temp room, which isn't that big, but you go in and there's sort of the center round piece, and then there's 4 rooms where they show the war as 4 different points from 4 different points of view. The American view, the Canadian view, the British view, and then the native view. Oh. And basically what the exhibit shows is that everybody wins except for the natives. Yeah. And that the natives really got the short end of the stick, which is sort of an unfortunate theme of both Canadian and American history. That happens. But given that, from the other perspectives, everybody can win, that creates this historical debate now, and especially if you read message boards, which you just shouldn't do. It's never a good idea to read a message board. Right. But whenever, I think when the government started commemorating the war, the Canadian government, all the message boards would say, "Yeah, we won, go Canada!" Very rah. And I think the Americans can make the same case. So, we know how, or I know how the war is thought of in Canada. How is it thought of in the United States, if at all?
The if at all is important because it's not thought of in the United States. I think there was, I did read in the paper something about a celebration of the War of 1812. And I don't know whether it got much publicity.
Yeah.
But certainly it's not getting the kind of attention that, say, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War get and continue to get with reenactors and the rest of that. So it doesn't get much attention. But the attention that it does get in textbooks really focus around two things. One is Jackson's victory in New Orleans. Yeah. And that's what gives the impression of winning the war because of that tremendous defeat and the death of Packenham and the repelling of the British troops. And then sea battles. There's the USS Constitution, harbored
Old Ironside.
Old Ironsides.
Yeah.
And that it gets lots of attention because of its victory and being Old Ironsides.
Yes.
And the longest, the oldest active naval vessel in the United States.
Which is a side note. When I was in Boston a couple of years ago, you have to go through like airport security to get on that thing.
Yeah.
I was stunned.
Yeah. Well, that's 9/11 has created those checkpoints all over the place and particularly for something like Old Ironsides, which is a national landmark. So if you think about, or if you looked at how Americans, if they thought about it or knew about the War of 1812 at all, those might be the two things they would refer to: sea victories, and if they knew about the Constitution, the Boston Constitution, and Jackson. They wouldn't talk about the terrible defeat of the American militia, which led to the burning of Washington, D.C.
Right.
They might refer to the burning of Washington, D.C., which is known, but it would be Dolly Madison preserving all of the materials.
Yes.
And then how nasty the British were to burn our capital, which was done in retribution to the burning of York by the Americans. But we don't talk about that. We burned your capital. Yeah. The British turn around and say, well, we're going to burn your capital.
Which is interesting, because in Canada, a lot of people are proud of that moment. That's a national high point for some.
Of burning the American.
Burning the White House.
Sure.
That's a thrill.
Yeah.
There's a song by this, it's like a parody song group called, it's about the War of 1812, and one of the lyrics is, if you go to, it's about burning the White House. Like, if you go to Washington, bring a pack of matches and we'll burn it again. Okay.
Well, I guess the compensation for the Americans is the defense of Baltimore. And then, as you mentioned, the Star-Spangled Banner and Francis Scott Key, this attempt to invade or attack Baltimore and it being repelled. But if you go to the baseball game again, you could ask somebody, well, when was the Star-Spangled Banner written and what was it about? They would say, I don't know. So the connection to the War of 1812 is probably not much.
Yeah, because I guess there's the irony that a lot of people cheer at like the bombs bursting in air part, when those are actually those are Canadian or British bombs against the United States.
That's right.
Those are the bombs burst and everyone's clapping and cheering. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing was this: do you think maybe if William Henry Harrison hadn't died so fast and his presidency had actually turned into something, maybe his role in the War of 1812 at Tippecanoe might have gotten a little more publicity too, but because he's sort of a forgotten, or at least I'm assuming he's a forgotten president. Sort of in that role, because if he has a prominent presidency, and you also have Andrew Jackson, who is a prominent figure, maybe that could lead more attention to the War of 1812. Here's two presidents, who potentially, like if let's say William Henry Harrison had 2 terms or something and had done something significant, as opposed to being dead in a month after his inauguration.
Well, in the case of Jackson, the association with him is Jacksonian Democracy. The War of 1812 is one of the illustrations of his success as a general. But his rise as a politician is due to his success as a general.
Sure.
And so the War of 1812 is important in his political success. You had mentioned the native people who really came out on the short end of it. Well, the Americans were not able to acquire Canada by military action. The other part of the War of 1812 was the war against the Creeks in the south of the United States, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, that area. They used the War of 1812 as a pretext to carry on a conflict against the Native Americans, not only in the Northwest, Tecumseh, and who was killed, but also in the South. And the result was the acquisition of hundreds of millions of acres that had belonged to the Creek people. And eventually they're forced out of the area that they even retain. They're forced across the Mississippi in the so-called Trail of Tears. Yeah. So that's, again, part of the agenda that people had. They wanted that Indian land. Mm-hmm. The war gave them the opportunity to do it, even though it had no connection to English and French policies or the invasion of Canada. It is, again, sort of the war mentality and the fruits of war that you can gain.
Mm-hmm. Now, this isn't academic. Yeah. This is not an academic question. Now, but if we had to rank, say, the reasons for the war as to why it happened, like, what would we put as like a number 1, 2? Like would we put territorial expansion 1? Would we put the sovereignty issues 1? Would we put orders in council, British impressment, or I guess those would be tied in?
Right.
Like, or is it just too complicated to do that?
Well, I think you can rank them, but then you'd have to segment the group. That is, for some groups, it might be honor and sovereignty would be number 1. And it might be for some of the elite Republicans, that is, members of the Republican Party like Madison. Probably for the ordinary person, it would be the interference with American trade and the impressment of sailors. That would be an infringement upon American sovereignty, but less of the abstraction and more the action and the arrogance of the British, and then the errors that occurred, that is, American citizens being taken and impressed. Yeah. And also sailors imprisoned because they're violating the trade rules. So they end up in Dartmoor prison in England, which is kind of a dang dire place, held there until their release. And that, of course, that has repercussions in families and communities to have those people imprisoned. Sure. So I suppose on the ground level, it would be those things, as well as the interference with American trade, the economic hardship that would produce for merchants, people who are related to that.
Yeah. So the stuff that actually affects people day to day.
Day to day, that would be the thing.
Okay. I would think. This boom in nationalism after the war that you've talked about, would that have anything to do, or would that feed into the Monroe Doctrine coming out later, or would that be a separate thing?
Well, that's a
so
good
this
point.
concept of manifest destiny really being born or put onto paper in the Monroe Doctrine. Is that still part of this flow that comes out after the war?
It is.
Yeah.
There is this burst of nationalism that follows the war, 1815 and particularly 1816. A new generation of congressmen are elected. And there is a big push in the newspapers to preserve the relics of the revolution, to gather the documents, to honor individuals, which is really contrary to the Republican spirit of the revolution, which is, as your civic duty as a Republican is to fight for your nation and then just return, like a Roman, I suppose, to your civilian life without particular honors other than what's in, quote, in your heart and what others recognize. But now they're beginning to see, like other civilizations, other societies, you need to canonize those values and put them into symbols that people who aren't familiar with those experiences can now look at these as kind of standards. So that's why collecting the papers of noted Americans and publishing them became important. Preserving those papers. There's a push to preserve Valley Forge, which before is just a site, to make it hallowed ground. Right. This is where people with bloodied feet survived the winters, the horrible winters of 1776 and 1777, to continue the fight. This is an example of their patriotism. So they're taking the concepts and transferring them into symbols and sites in order to provide a framework for people to reconnect to the revolution. That gives a burst to this nationalism. And America's sovereignty, as a quote, they won the war. They upheld their honor and their sovereignty. That's keeping England, keeping the Europeans out of the American sphere, since they couldn't get Canada, became an important part of American foreign policy, and that's where the Monroe Doctrine comes in. The Western Hemisphere is going to be the American area, and the Caribbean is going to be the American lake. Right. So we're going to make sure, or at least establish our point, that what goes on there is of direct interest to the United States.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I remember reading something about if the founders or everyone who signed the Declaration of Independence understood now how they're thought of as these sort of lionized heroes, that they wouldn't. That's not what they wanted.
Yeah, correct.
And as a Canadian, I'm proud that sort of the building of that happened after the War of 1812. We could contribute something to that. So and just in talking here, the impression I get is that even though it may not be remembered as such, we can classify the War of 1812 as an important event in American history.
Yes, you can.
As a critical. A critical shift. And you had a good quote here.
I do. This is a quotation from Gordon Wood's book, The Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early Republic, 1789 to 1815. And Gordon Wood is one of the preeminent, prominent American historians, written on the American Revolution and has extended his research into the early Republic.
And always good because... for my fields, my doctoral fields, I did an American field, and I had to read, I think, a couple of his books. Yeah. So if they're on that field list,
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. Well deserved to be on that field. And this is what he's written, chapter 18. The War of 1812 is the strangest war in American history. It was a war in its own right, but also a war within a war. A part of the larger war between Britain and France that had been going on since France's National Convention declared war on Britain in February 1793. Although the total American casualties in the war were relatively light, 6,765, far fewer in the entire 2.5 years of war than those killed and wounded in a single one of Napoleon's many battles, it was nonetheless one of the most important wars in American history.
Wow.
And then the chapter develops that thesis that it's one of the most important wars.
Wow.
And it has to do with the issues of honor, sovereignty, nationalism, and then, as we were talking previously, the burst of nationalism that resulted from the experiences of that war.
Well, it's too bad people don't remember it then.
Yeah.
I know PBS did do I think it might have been 2 hours. I think it was an hour documentary on it. And that's the only thing I've seen.
Oh, I should have seen that. It would have been.
I think it's still up there.
It is. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's still
I'll
up.
have to take a look at it now.
So thank you very much for coming down. I really do appreciate it. So that's John Resch from the University of New Hampshire at Manchester talking to us about the War of 1812, a little American perspective as we go a little international on the podcast for the first time. If you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, the email account for the podcast specifically is historyslam@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter. I've tweeted stuff about our road trip, and you can see me and my brother and my buddy Dave in Fu Manchus that we shaved in honor of Sal Fasano, who's the manager of the Fisher Cats. We actually got to meet Sal Fasano, and he shook our hand. We got a picture with him. It was pretty cool. But I'm on Twitter, so I have post stuff like there. It's Dr. Shawnee Fever, so you can find me there. And until we talk again, if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Check out ActiveHistory.ca for more features and articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.